from a plane that crashed into the bottom of the sea without witnesses. A plane that failed to brake in time and ended up crashing into a hangar. Even a plane ended up crashing directly into the city. What you're about to see is the top 7 plane moments that shocked the world forever. Starting with a flight that didn't account for strong winds and ended in an accident, we're talking about Delta Airlines Flight 191. On August 2, 1985, Delta Airlines Flight 191 was approaching Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar was arriving from Fort Lauderdale with 163 passengers and crew on board. It was a hot summer afternoon, and thunderstorms were forming around the airport. As the aircraft descended toward runway 17L, the crew saw rain ahead, but believed it was manageable. Other aircraft had landed just minutes earlier. The approach continued. Then, the plane entered the storm. Without warning, Flight 191 was hit by a powerful downdraft. The aircraft was suddenly pushed downward as airspeed rapidly dropped. Inside the cockpit, alarms sounded as the engines struggled to maintain thrust. The plane briefly recovered, only to fly directly into a violent microburst, a column of rapidly descending air. First, the aircraft was forced upward. Then, just seconds later, it was slammed back toward the ground. The pilots pushed the engines to full power, but it wasn't enough. The L-111 struck the ground short of the runway, hitting a highway, crushing a car, and killing its driver instantly. The aircraft then slammed into airport structures and burst into flames. In less than a minute, a routine landing turned into a catastrophic crash. Of the 163 people on board, 137 lost their lives. It was one of the deadliest weather-related aviation accidents in U.S. history. The investigation revealed a phenomenon that was poorly understood at the time: wind shear caused by a microburst. A microburst is an intense, localized column of sinking air within a thunderstorm. When an aircraft flies through it, it experiences sudden changes in wind direction and speed, first gaining airspeed, then losing it catastrophically. Flight 191 encountered this exact sequence. The crew initially felt an increase in performance, followed by an extreme loss of lift and airspeed at very low altitude, leaving no room to recover. At the time, aircraft had no onboard wind shear detection systems, and pilots were trained to rely mostly on visual cues. The danger was invisible until it was too late. The consequences of Flight 191 were enormous. The accident directly led to the development and mandatory installation of ground-based Doppler weather radar at major airports. Later, onboard wind shear warning systems became standard equipment on commercial airliners. Pilot training worldwide was rewritten to include microburst recognition and escape maneuvers. Approach procedures near thunderstorms were fundamentally changed. Historically, Delta Airlines Flight 191 reshaped aviation weather safety. It transformed how storms are detected, how pilots are trained, and how airports manage severe weather. The crash proved that nature can overwhelm even experienced crews, but it also ensured that future pilots would have the tools and knowledge that the crew of Flight 191 never had. But if you think that accident was complicated, the next one changed the history of aviation because it crashed in the middle of the city. We're talking about Cubana de Aviación, Flight 972. On May 18, 2018, Cubana de Aviación Flight 972 prepared for departure from José Martí International Airport in Havana, Cuba. The Boeing 737-200 was operating a domestic flight to Holguín, carrying more than 110 passengers and crew. From the outside, everything looked routine. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, passengers felt the familiar push of takeoff. Moments later, the plane lifted into the air, but something was wrong. Almost immediately after liftoff, the aircraft began to lose altitude. Instead of climbing, the Boeing 737 struggled to stay airborne. Witnesses on the ground watched in horror as the plane wobbled, banking sharply while barely clearing buildings beyond the runway. Inside the cabin, panic erupted. The aircraft rolled violently to the right, then to the left. Passengers screamed as the plane descended uncontrollably just seconds after takeoff. Less than 1 minute after leaving the ground, Flight 972 slammed into a field near the airport perimeter. The impact was devastating. The aircraft broke apart and erupted into flames, sending a massive plume of black smoke into the sky. Emergency crews rushed to the scene, but the destruction was overwhelming. Out of everyone on board, only a handful survived the initial impact, many with critical injuries. What should have been a short domestic flight turned into one of the deadliest aviation disasters in Cuba's modern history, unfolding in full view of the airport it had just departed. The investigation into Flight 972 quickly focused on the moments before takeoff. The aircraft involved was more than 40 years old and had been leased from a foreign company, along with its crew. While age alone does not cause accidents, investigators knew they had to examine every detail carefully. Flight data revealed a critical problem during takeoff. The aircraft's weight and balance were severely miscalculated. Investigators found that the plane was significantly heavier than expected, and worse, the weight was improperly distributed. This caused the aircraft's center of gravity to shift dangerously far aft. When the pilots rotated for takeoff, the aircraft pitched up too aggressively, losing airspeed almost immediately. With insufficient lift and unstable control, the plane entered an unrecoverable situation just seconds after leaving the runway. There was no evidence of engine failure, sabotage, or weather-related issues. The engines were producing power, but the aircraft was simply too heavy and poorly balanced to fly safely. The investigation also raised concerns about operational oversight, including load calculations, documentation, and coordination between the leasing company and the airline. Flight 972 exposed how a simple but critical error on the ground can doom an aircraft before it ever reaches altitude. The tragedy led to renewed scrutiny of leasing practices, crew coordination, and weight and balance procedures, reminding the aviation world that even in the age of advanced technology, basic fundamentals remain a matter of life and death. But sadly, that accident wasn't the only one that marked history. The next one couldn't stop in time and ended up crashing with hundreds of lives on board. We're talking about Birgenair Flight 301. On February 6, 1996, Birgenair Flight 301 prepared for departure from Puerto Plata, Dominican Republic. The Boeing 757 was operating a charter flight to Frankfurt, Germany, carrying 189 passengers and crew. It was a dark night over the Atlantic Ocean. Shortly after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed away from the runway, the cockpit began to fill with confusion. The captain's airspeed indicator showed a dangerously high speed, far higher than expected, while other instruments told a different story. Within seconds, warning alarms began to sound. The aircraft's overspeed warning activated even though the plane was still climbing normally. The pilots reduced engine power, believing the aircraft was accelerating too fast. But in reality, the opposite was happening. The Boeing 757 began to slow down. As the pilots tried to understand the conflicting information, the aircraft continued climbing, losing airspeed with every second. The first officer's instruments showed normal values, while the captain's instruments showed extreme and impossible readings. Then, suddenly, the aircraft stalled. Flight 301 rolled sharply to one side and entered a steep dive toward the ocean. The pilots fought desperately to regain control, but the aircraft was already in an unrecoverable descent. Just minutes after takeoff, Birgenair Flight 301 slammed into the Atlantic Ocean at high speed. There were no survivors. The crash happened at night, far from witnesses, leaving behind only radar data, wreckage, and haunting questions about how a modern jet could be lost so quickly after departure. The investigation uncovered a deceptively simple but deadly cause. One of the aircraft's pitot tubes, used to measure airspeed, had become blocked by insects while the plane was parked for several days in the tropical climate. A small wasp nest prevented accurate airspeed readings. Because of this blockage, the captain's airspeed indicator showed false data immediately after takeoff. Faced with conflicting information and multiple warning alarms, the crew misinterpreted the situation. Believing the aircraft was overspeeding, they reduced thrust, exactly the wrong action. The accident exposed a critical weakness in human response to unreliable airspeed situations. At the time, training for such failures was limited, and cockpit procedures were not clear enough to guide pilots through the confusion. The consequences were profound. After Flight 301, airlines worldwide introduced stricter pitot tube inspection and protection procedures, especially in tropical environments. Aircraft were required to use pitot covers whenever parked, even for short periods. Pilot training was also transformed. Unreliable airspeed scenarios became a standard part of simulator training, teaching crews how to recognize false readings and rely on pitch and power settings instead of instruments alone. Historically, Birgenair Flight 301 became one of aviation's most important case studies, proving that tiny maintenance oversights can trigger catastrophic chains of human error. The accident reshaped how pilots are trained to handle instrument failures and reminded the aviation world that sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones too small to see. But if you think this accident was chaotic, the next one was an explosion in midair, terrorizing an entire country. We're talking about TWA Flight 800.
On the night of July 17, 1996, the sky over Long Island, New York, lit up with an explosion that shook everyone nearby. Just 12 minutes after takeoff, the Trans World Airlines Boeing 747 exploded into a ball of fire in midair. Witnesses on the coast watched in horror as a gigantic explosion lit up the ocean. In just seconds, TWA Flight 800 went from a routine trip to one of aviation's most controversial tragedies. 230 people were aboard, never imagining that night would be the last of their lives. The shocking thing is that no one knew what had happened. Was it an attack, a missile, or something more sinister inside the plane itself? Emergency calls began to flood the radio frequencies, and within seconds, the news spread across the United States. A plane had exploded in mid-air. What happened next sparked theories, conspiracies, and an investigation that would last for years. And the most shocking thing, for months, no one was clear about what had really happened. In the next few minutes, you'll discover the truth behind TWA Flight 800. TWA Flight 800 took off from JFK Airport bound for Paris, with 230 people on board. For many, it was the start of a dream vacation. For others, the long-awaited reunion with their families. But what no one knew was that many of those passengers had only 12 minutes left to live. In the cockpit, Captain Steven Snyder, with more than 17,000 flight hours, was accompanied by First Officer Stephen Epstein and Flight Engineer Oliver Crick, an experienced crew accustomed to crossing the Atlantic. It was a solid team prepared for any emergency, except the one that was about to happen. Meanwhile, the passengers settled into their seats, some flipping through magazines, others preparing for sleep. The atmosphere was completely normal. But beneath their feet, in the heart of the 747, a fuel tank was already turning into a time bomb. It's 8:31 p.m. TWA 800 is crossing the sky over Long Island when suddenly a brutal explosion rocks the Boeing 747. The plane becomes a fireball in midair. Witnesses on the coast describe an orange glow that lit up the night as if it were daytime. Some claim to have seen a flash, like a missile ascending, seconds before the explosion. That image would fuel the most terrifying theories. The 747 begins to tear in two. The passenger cabin falls first, while the rest burns out of control on its way to the Atlantic.
Imagine the scene. A giant plane splitting in the air and going down in flames in front of hundreds of witnesses.
On the ground, the horror was indescribable. An entire plane had disappeared from the sky in a matter of seconds. What you will hear below is a dramatized reenactment of the CVR. Based on official transcripts, discretion is advised.
Checklist complete. Everything looks stable.
Speed and altitude climbing normally. You see that fuel flow indicator on engine 4? It's fluctuating a bit.
TWA 800 New York Center, radar contact, maintain presence at heading. Roger, main heading to heading 2A8
The readings on number 4 are still unstable.
All right, keep monitoring it.
Wait, do you feel that? Oh, them to the stats. It's fluctuating a bit. We've got a...
Minutes after the explosion, emergency radio was flooded with reports. Plane down, explosion in midair, multiple witnesses. Within hours, the news was on every network. A TWA Boeing 747 had exploded off the coast of New York. But the most disturbing thing was the eyewitness accounts. More than 200 people claimed to have seen a flash, like a missile rising into the sky, seconds before the explosion. Theories quickly multiplied. A terrorist attack? A military missile launched by mistake? Or a bomb hidden inside the plane? The mystery grew, and while the families of the victims demanded answers, the entire world was asking the same question. Had someone shot down the TWA 800? Or was the threat within the plane itself? The investigation was one of the longest and most complex in aviation history. More than 4 years were spent analyzing every piece of the plane, every testimony, and every hypothesis. For months, the entire country was convinced it had been an attack. But investigators began to see a different truth. Finally, the NTSB issued its final report in 2000 stating, the probable cause of the accident of TWA Flight 800 was an explosion of the center fuel tank resulting from the ignition of flammable vapors within the tank. The most likely ignition source was an electrical short outside the tank that allowed sufficient energy to enter through associated electrical wiring. In other words, there was no missile, no bomb. What destroyed TWA 800 was an internal electrical spark. The tragedy, which many imagined to be an act of war, ended up being the result of a technical failure within the plane itself. As the world processed the official case, another inevitable question arose. Who would assume civil liability for the loss of 230 lives? Investigations pointed to an internal failure, and that paved the way for multi-million-dollar lawsuits against TWA and Boeing. The airline agreed to compensate the families, and Boeing, the manufacturer of the 747, reached confidential settlements with several victims. But money didn't heal the pain. Some family members declared, "None of this will bring back those we love." All we ask is that this never happens again. Others demanded urgent changes, better maintenance, safer electrical systems, less vulnerable tanks. Each voice was a reminder that behind the numbers lay broken stories. This episode made it clear that when an airline tragedy occurs, the truth doesn't end with the technical report. It also involves facing accountability, healing wounds, and ensuring that the sacrifice of so many lives was not in vain. TWA Flight 800 reminds us that behind every number and every headline, there are lives, dreams, and entire families. Thanks to this tragedy, the industry implemented stricter controls on electrical systems and fuel tank ventilation, reducing the risk of something like this happening again. As one family member said, "We can't change the past, but we can demand a safer future." Every lesson written in pain is also a legacy of protection for those who today entrust their lives to heaven.
And although this accident was due to a mechanical failure, the next one was a terrorist attack, forcing the world to change its security policies. We're talking about Pan Am Flight 103. It was a cold December night in 1988. At London's Heathrow Airport, a Pan Am Boeing 747 was preparing for a routine flight to New York. Passengers boarding with smiles, crew checking every detail. Everything seemed normal. No one on that plane, nor on the ground, knew that within minutes, the night sky would erupt in one of the most shocking tragedies in aviation history. A thunderous blast, a flash of light, and suddenly silence shattered by the roar of destruction. Homes burning, streets covered in debris, and 270 lives extinguished in an instant. What could bring down a giant of the skies in mere seconds? Who was behind this act? In the next few minutes, we'll uncover the truth. Because this is the story of Pan Am Flight 103. Heathrow Airport, London. Pan Am Flight 103 is preparing for takeoff to New York. As passengers quietly settle into their seats and the crew makes final checks, in the cargo hold a suitcase unlike the rest is carefully placed. Inside, an explosive device set to detonate mid-flight. No one knows, no one imagines. But from this moment, the clock to disaster has already begun ticking. Pan Am Flight 103 cruises smoothly at over 30,000 feet, leaving England's lights behind as it heads across the Atlantic to New York.
Approaching waypoint Sierra November.
Roger that. Altitude steady.
In the cockpit, the crew chats, checks instruments, and stays on course. Passengers relax. Some read, others sleep, others simply gaze out the window at the moonlit clouds. But deep in the cargo hold, hidden among the luggage, a bomb waits. Its timer moving relentlessly, counting down the seconds to catastrophe. No one knows it, but every sip of coffee, every laugh, every word is taking place under the shadow of a deadly countdown. One that in minutes will seal the fate of everyone on board. But before continuing, if you like this video, please subscribe. It helps me grow and continue making more videos like this. At 7:03 p.m., a flash shatters the calm of the night. A violent explosion tears the Boeing 747 apart midair. Debris engulfed in flames scatters for miles. Bodies fall from the sky. Burning fragments of the aircraft crash onto rooftops, streets, and fields. In the small town of Lockerbie, Scotland, houses burn, the ground shakes, and chaos takes over. In seconds, Pan Am Flight 103 has ceased to exist. What you are about to hear is the actual cockpit voice recorder from the moment of the accident. Viewer discretion is advised.
I'd like to thank you for flying Pan Am, and to wish you a pleasant flight and a happy holiday. I'll call Benson, sir. Good evening, Scottish. This is Clipper 103, requesting oceanic clearance.
The roar of the explosion is gone. On the ground, the silence is broken only by distant sirens and cries. Lockerbie has become a battlefield against fire. Houses destroyed, streets covered in twisted metal, and bodies among the debris. Emergency crews work tirelessly, but the magnitude of the tragedy is indescribable. 270 lives lost, including passengers, crew, and townspeople. Amid the devastation, one question grows louder.
Looks like no survivors.
What could destroy an aircraft of this size in mid-air? The investigation is only beginning. And what they will uncover reveals an act of horror planned with precision. The investigation revealed the truth. The explosion was no accident. In the cargo hold, a bomb hidden inside a suitcase had destroyed Pan Am Flight 103 mid-flight. The device had been loaded into checked luggage during its connection at Frankfurt Airport before arriving in London. After years of investigation and international pressure, authorities held Abdelbasit al-Megrahi, a Libyan intelligence agent responsible for the attack. The world was shocked. 270 lives taken in seconds by an act of terror calculated with surgical precision. Today, in Lockerbie, a memorial stands in honor of every victim, and of a flight forever remembered as one of the darkest chapters in aviation history. But this wasn't the only one that left a mark on aviation history. The next one left a sea of fire when it crashed on the highway. We're talking about Japan Airlines Flight 516. On January 2, 2024, Japan Airlines Flight 516 was completing its final approach into Tokyo's Haneda Airport after a domestic flight from Sapporo. The aircraft, an Airbus A350 carrying nearly 400 passengers and crew, was landing during the busy New Year holiday period. As the jet touched down on the runway, everything appeared normal for just a split second. Then, without warning, a violent impact shook the aircraft. The A350 had collided with a Japan Coast Guard turboprop that was positioned on the runway. Almost instantly, flames erupted beneath the fuselage. Fire spread rapidly as the aircraft continued rolling, trailing sparks and burning fuel. Inside the cabin, smoke filled the air as alarms sounded and passengers realized something was terribly wrong. Despite the growing fire, the cabin crew acted with extreme precision. Emergency slides were deployed and passengers were ordered to evacuate immediately. Within minutes, hundreds of people escaped onto the runway as the aircraft became fully engulfed in flames. Miraculously, every passenger and crew member on Flight 516 survived. The A350 burned almost completely, collapsing into a charred shell as firefighters battled the blaze. The dramatic footage of the burning aircraft quickly spread worldwide, stunning viewers who had never seen such a large, modern airliner consumed by fire, with everyone still alive. The investigation revealed that the accident was not caused by a technical failure of the passenger aircraft, but by a breakdown in runway coordination and communication. The Coast Guard aircraft had entered or remained on the runway without proper clearance while Flight 516 was cleared to land. Contributing factors included miscommunication between air traffic control and the Coast Guard crew, confusion during nighttime operations, and the intense workload associated with holiday traffic. The Coast Guard aircraft was preparing for a humanitarian mission following an earthquake, adding urgency and complexity to the situation. Despite the tragedy for the Coast Guard crew, the survival of everyone aboard Flight 516 highlighted major advances in aviation safety. The A350's fire-resistant materials, improved evacuation procedures, and the crew's strict adherence to training all played a critical role. Japan Airlines Flight 516 became a powerful case study, proving that while accidents can still happen on the ground, modern aircraft design and disciplined crew response can turn what should have been a mass casualty disaster into a story of survival. And finally, I want to mention an accident that occurred due to human error and a lack of communication, when a plane about to take off was not informed that there was a fire truck on the ground. We are talking about LATAM Peru Flight 2213. On November 18, 2022, LATAM Peru Flight 2213 prepared for takeoff from Jorge Chávez International Airport in Lima. The Airbus A320 was bound for Juliaca, carrying passengers who expected a routine domestic flight. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway at high speed, something completely unexpected appeared ahead. A fire truck crossed directly into the aircraft's path. The collision was instant and violent. The right engine struck the emergency vehicle, tearing it apart and sending debris across the runway. Flames erupted immediately as the aircraft slid to a stop. Inside the cabin, passengers screamed as smoke filled the air. The crew initiated an emergency evacuation, deploying slides as firefighters rushed toward the scene, now facing a tragedy involving their own colleagues. All passengers and crew escaped the aircraft alive, but 2 firefighters lost their lives instantly, and another was critically injured. The runway was left covered in wreckage, and the airport shut down completely. Cameras captured the horrifying moment, showing how a normal takeoff turned into chaos in seconds. Investigators later confirmed that the accident was caused by a runway incursion during an authorized emergency drill. Several airport fire vehicles entered the active runway without proper clearance while the aircraft was accelerating for takeoff. Critical communication failures occurred between air traffic control and airport emergency crews. The pilots were never warned of vehicles on the runway, and by the time the fire truck became visible, it was too late to abort safely. The investigation revealed serious flaws in coordination, safety protocols, and risk management during live runway operations. Emergency exercises were allowed to take place while commercial flights were still departing. LATAM Peru Flight 2213 became one of the most shocking runway accidents in modern aviation, reminding the world that even on the ground, before leaving the Earth, aviation safety depends on flawless communication. This tragedy forced airports worldwide to reassess how emergency drills are conducted, proving that a single mistake on the runway can be just as deadly as a failure in the sky. But if you think this accident was chaotic, the next one had a chaotic ending, resulting in a massive crash that caused enormous national shock. We're talking about Jeju Air Flight 2216. On December 29, 2024, Jeju Air Flight 7C2216 was nearing the end of what should have been a routine domestic flight in South Korea. The Boeing 737-800 began its final approach to Muan International Airport during peak holiday travel season, with the aircraft fully loaded and the runway conditions far from ideal. As the plane descended, it became clear that the approach was unstable. The aircraft was coming in fast, slightly high, and fighting adverse weather conditions. Inside the cabin, passengers felt the sudden power changes as the pilots attempted to correct the descent in the final seconds before touchdown. When the aircraft finally touched down, it did so at excessive speed. The wheels slammed onto the runway, but the remaining distance was already disappearing. Despite maximum braking, the aircraft continued forward, unable to slow down in time. Within seconds, the plane overran the runway, crossed beyond the airport's safety area, and struck structures outside the perimeter. The impact triggered an immediate and violent fire. Flames engulfed the fuselage as thick black smoke filled the air. Emergency crews rushed toward the wreckage, but the intensity of the fire made rescue operations extremely difficult. What began as a routine landing ended in one of the most shocking aviation tragedies South Korea had seen in years. Early investigations pointed to a combination of operational and environmental factors rather than a single catastrophic failure. The primary issue was an unstable approach, something aviation procedures strictly warn against continuing. The aircraft arrived with too much energy, too fast and too high, leaving little margin for correction. Weather conditions played a critical role. The runway was affected by winter conditions, reducing braking effectiveness and increasing stopping distance. Once the aircraft touched down beyond the optimal point, physics took over. There simply wasn't enough runway left to safely decelerate. Another contributing factor was decision-making in the cockpit. Standard safety doctrine emphasizes that an unstable approach should result in an immediate go-around. Continuing the landing under those conditions significantly increased the risk of a runway overrun. Finally, the severity of the accident was worsened by what lay beyond the runway. Limited safety margins outside the airport boundary turned an overrun into a catastrophic collision and fire. Jeju Air Flight 7C-2216 became a harsh reminder that the final seconds of a flight are often the most dangerous, and that strict adherence to go-around procedures can mean the difference between a safe landing and disaster.